what homeowners can do with all these rate rises, and what opportunities are there for people moving forward. We've got Martin North with us here today to help clear up all these mixed messages we're seeing in the marketplace. This is a 3-part series to hopefully help clear up that uncertainty. This is part 3, so if you haven't seen parts 1 and 2, we'll leave a link in the description below so you can catch up to understand what's going on. So Martin, why has the Reserve Bank been very clear about getting inflation within their target band?
Well, they've just changed the CPI, so it now is reported monthly.
Oh, right.
So it's interesting because we have the first read, I think was it 2 weeks ago? Time flies when you're enjoying yourself. Yeah. So they basically now are reporting it every month, and then they do the quarterly, which is sort of a slightly revised version. Interestingly, the first monthly read, it showed that core inflation was still higher. And they also highlighted the fact that the rental sector was only growing at about 2%. Which, of course, is because they're looking at all rents, including those that haven't yet been reset, right? Whereas new rents are somewhere between 10 and 20% higher, depending on where you look. So there's a lot more pressure coming through from the rental sector, I think. And we're also seeing more embedded inflation in the latest numbers around some of the service sectors. And that was despite the fact that the cost of petroleum dropped dramatically from its peaks earlier on. That wasn't enough to offset the other inflationary costs. So we now have monthly CPI, which, as you say, should help the bank. But it's interesting because some time ago, Phil Lowe said it can take 12 to 18 months for the impacts of monetary policy to really be transparent in the economy. So you're dead right. They're still flying blind. And of course, many economists are saying, well, they're going to overshoot. They're going to put rates up too high and we're going to get into a recession. And then they'll have to sort of cut rates again. So that's sort of the sort of the story that many people have. But it's clear to me that they have to deal with inflation. And until inflation is below the 3%, 2 to 3% target, they won't be able to reverse.
And what can homeowners do? We've talked about the lag effect with the Reserve Bank and their 6 rate adjustments yet to see. Probably borrowers have only felt the first 3, maybe 4. We've talked about buffers going down, borrowers' buffers getting reduced, and the Reserve Bank really not going to do anything until inflation is stopped. So what can borrowers do out there? I know you talk about mortgage stress on a cash flow basis, but what can they do?
Yeah, so there's a few things. The first is that many households actually don't know the mortgage rate they're on. Weirdly, and many people are still paying more than what they should be paying, simply because they haven't shopped around. So the first thing is go find out what your mortgage rate is, and then go to some of the comparison sites and see whether it's the best rate that's available to you today. Because quite a few households that I've come across, they've been able to reduce their mortgage rate by 100 basis points, 1%, and that's a big one. Second one is that many households don't actually understand their cash flows, what's coming in, what's going out each month. About half of households have some sense of that, the other half don't. So very important to build a cash flow. And in fact, the Money Smart website at ASIC has a very useful tool that allows you to put money in. There are other apps that can do that, but understand your cash flow. And then very importantly, prioritize those money going out, particularly, are you paying the important things versus the urgent things? Are you, spending money on the things that you don't really need to spend money on? Because there's a prioritization question. And I keep coming back to things like, how many streaming services do you have, and how big is your mobile phone plan? Does it need to be, there are things that you can do. Third is, of course, that it may well be that you can refinance as well. And, there's a lot of people still refinancing and being able to mess with that. Now, of course, the problem there is if you're not careful, you can end up with a longer loan, and that superficially means you're paying less, but actually you're paying more in terms of interest. So that doesn't always work, but it might get you through. I think the final point to say is that there are sometimes people whose financial circumstances have changed and won't change back. And they're the ones that need to make some decisions early rather than later, in my view, because there's still at the moment equity in most of the properties, because prices haven't dropped that much yet. If you leave it and in 6 to 9 months later, prices have dropped another 15%, you might actually not have any equity left in the place. You might still owe the bank money, even if you paid the mortgage off. So sometimes, once you've done the hard thinking, taking an early decision to sell may not be as horrendous as some of the other alternatives. or at least talk to your lender, because they do have hardship arrangements and schemes, and explain the situation to them. Don't put your head in the sand and don't just assume she'll be right. Remember that real wages is still going backwards because inflation's 6-7%, right? Wages aren't growing anything like that. So you are losing every week, every month, and that's a problem. The other point to make is that people don't like having these conversations and sometimes just don't want to deal with it, right? Now, if you go back to the 2000s, people got out of jail because wages growth really started to take off, and they actually got themselves out of deep water because of wages growth going much faster than inflation. There's no chance of that. Even the RBA is saying real wages growth will be nothing to write home about till 2024, 2025. So there's no short-term wages fix here, unless maybe you can switch jobs and, you know, work more hours and those sorts of things. And by the way, in my surveys, we are seeing more people doing second jobs, working more hours to try and bring more in, to try and cover the costs, to chase the mortgage rate up. So that's sort of another factor. So it's a really complicated situation, but don't ignore it is what I'd say.
Definitely. And I guess you've got some great data on all this sort of stuff. Can you maybe explain how you look at mortgage stress on a cash flow basis and which households are struggling at the moment?
Yeah, so we survey households on an ongoing basis, and that allows us to then look at a granular level about what's going on. Let me show you, here's an example, right? This is postcode 4000, which is, you know, right in the center of Brisbane, right? And this is based on my data. So it's also marrying up census data as well. So for example, in this postcode, there's about 9,200 households, right? 13% own their property outright, 18% borrow, 68% rent. So that's quite a high rental proportion, right? Now, of those borrowing, not that many are in mortgage stress in this particular postcode, but a lot in rental stress are actually finding it quite difficult at the moment. So stress levels are quite high. Then what I do is I model where prices may go. And I've got three scenarios, the best case and worst case. So the best case is that rates don't get very high and inflation comes off. That will be the Tim Lawless scenario, I think. The base case would be that we actually get recessions in the UK, the US, and elsewhere, but not here. The worst case is we get a recession here in Australia as well. And I have those scenarios for housing units, right? But it's interesting then looking at what proportion of houses. So there's 8% that are houses, 87% of units, and there's a few others like living over shops and things. And then you've got the gross investment yields. So that's quite good, 5.3% gross investment yield, but the net investment yield is only 1.9%. So that's quite low. But believe me, many other investors segments in other places are actually even a lot lower. And then if you look up here, I've got the taxable income from the ATO and the household census. And I've worked out what the monthly disposable income. So a typical household in this postcode has a monthly disposable of $6,600, right? And around 1/3 of their monthly disposable income is going on to pay the mortgage at the moment, on average, $2,239, right? And about 1/3 also going on the renting. Now, those are big numbers, 1/3, right? And so I use this data to be able to then actually figure out what it really means in terms of specific households. Now, that's one right in the center, right? Now, if I go, I'm just going to pick a random one, see whether it works. No, I picked one that wasn't.
I can give you one, maybe 4035.
4035. Okay, there you go, 4035. Okay, so this is Albany Creek, and in the Hills district of Queensland at the SA3 level. Okay, now this one, another 9,000, right? 32% own outright, but 51% are borrowing. So that's much higher proportion of people actually with a mortgage. Only 16% renting. But look at this. 43% of those who are borrowing are actually in mortgage stress. Now, that's on a cash flow basis. So they've got more money going out than money coming in each month. And 66% of renters have a problem, right? And then you can look at the scenarios. Well, you know, the best case scenarios, you might see houses rise by about 4% over the next 3 years. The base case down close to 20%. The worst case, even worse than that. 86% of houses here in this particular postcode, a very small number of units. And interestingly, not many vacant properties. In census night, 3.9% were vacant, which is 383. In a couple of the other postcodes, it's much, much higher. But look at the gross investment yield, 4.6%. Not bad, Net investment yield 1.4%. That's not flash because we think inflation's running at what, 4, 5, 6%. You're not making much in terms of returns. Then if you look at the taxable income, ATO says per individual 92,000. The household census says 127,000. That translates to a disposable monthly income of around $7,200. But the average mortgage repayments about $2,600, which requires 36% of monthly disposable income. For a renter, it's a bit less at about 32.5%. So you can sort of see when you start going into the granularity that I'm going into here, you can see there's some really interesting things going on. And you start to see a correlation then between disposable income, mortgage stress, all those things. And the problem is I've been tracking this for quite some time. So effectively it does get worse. It's got a lot worse over recent times. Now, let me just show you one other little exhibit here because I've got this other one. Let me just switch it up. Hang on. So I've given you information with just a typical couple of codes. I have that for pretty much every postcode across the country, but then I map it, right? And here's an example of mortgage stress in and around Brisbane. And the way to read this is that the map goes sort of red and orange at the top. This is the count of households in mortgage stress. And as you go down to blue, it's at the bottom. And you can see in and around Brisbane, well, there's a few areas like sort of Camp Hill, right? And is it Corona down and then down towards Ipswich? So there are some issues. Now, if you pull out and sort of get a bit of a sort of a wider view, you can start to see that there are some hotspots around Brisbane where, in fact, there are a few issues. And in fact, as you pull out, you start to see, for example, if you go down to the Gold Coast, there's a fair degree of mortgage stress in and around the Gold Coast, for example, right? And, if I pull out further, you can look at places like Toowoomba or the Sunshine Coast, but I'll just go up to the Sunshine Coast because I can. So this is a national map that I maintain that just shows you the distribution. So this is the Sunshine Coast here, right? And what's fascinating about this is that this then starts to give you some intelligence about where property prices are more likely to fall, because there's a high correlation between price falls and high levels of mortgage stress, which if you think about it, makes sense because it means that people are less able to afford to make those repayments. They might have to actually put the property in the market. So there's a sort of quite interesting correlation. When I run my scenarios, one of the elements that I use, as well as things like interest rates and migration, is actually stress. So that's how the system works.
So a lot of excellent data there, Martin. I guess there's still opportunities out there for those that are keen to look into the market. I know each postcode and changes from postcode to postcode. So I know you have an ability to help people out with this sort of stuff. So tell me a bit more about that and what that looks like.
Yeah. So, I am very clear on this. When you look at property, you have to go granular, right? You cannot look at generic averages or indices for Brisbane or Sydney or whatever, right? It's completely meaningless. You need to get granular to understand what's going on. And what I tried to do with those examples was demonstrate how when you go down local, you can start to see quite different things. And I run a particular service called my one-to-one service, where I can actually help somebody look at a particular suburb and use some of my data to help them and get them to understand what's really going on in that suburb. And there are still opportunities. There are still some first-time buyers saying, well, maybe this is a good opportunity for me personally because I want to buy. I'm not too worried if I lose a little bit of capital in the short term because longer term, it's going to go up. And this can help them sort of spot where might be a good place to look. We've also got some property investors trying to work out whether they should hold the property, whether they should buy more property. So it sort of gets into quite a granular discussion. And in fact, one of my one-on-one conversation, I also pull the data from the latest property portals to show you what's around and look at things like flood maps, which is something which a lot of people don't look at, crime maps, the development plan, all of those things, because you start then and particularly flood-related issues, very important, just to get a flavor of what's going on. So that's what I do. And I have quite a few of these conversations at the moment because a lot of people confused about the market, and like I say, they just read the newspaper, then it says everything's fine or everything's falling or, no. You've got to go granular to really understand. And units and houses are doing different things. Different locations are doing different things. And that's what I sort of specialize in.
And if viewers out there are interested in this service, how can they find you?
Well, if they go to my website at digitalfinanceanalytics.com, go to the blog, and on the blog, you can see the one-to-one service there, or you can just contact me via the blog directly, send me a message and say, I'm interested, send me some more details, and I'm happy to share that. I'm booking about 3 to 5 weeks ahead because I've got so many people saying, help, what's going on?
And do you have any final thoughts before we conclude today?
Well, I think there's just three quick things. The first is nobody knows ultimately where rates are going to go, right? If we get, a broader European war, all bets are off. If we get significant recessions starting to appear, including in Australia, all bets are off. On the other hand, if inflation remains stubbornly high, rates will go higher, and that means that the mortgage rate will go higher too. So nobody knows, and you can talk to different people and you can get different points of view. That's why I run different scenarios. You need to play the counterfactual at the moment. What if? What if my income doesn't go up? What if prices? So you got to do the thinking. And the final point, just to reemphasize what I said, and go granular. Don't just take the generic, Brisbane prices have only dropped 3% or 6%, whatever it is. Look at it as a detailed level. Units and houses are doing different things. Different types of property are doing different things at different time frames, and therefore the generic conversations about property, I think, are very unhelpful. It's a bit like looking at the ASX and say, well, the ASX today went down 1%, right? But if you look at the individual, that's the key message. And the final point to make is, don't panic. Property cycles come and go. And I've lived through about 4 cycles, up and down, right? It's never as bad once you've been through it than it appears to be in the middle of it. So I always say to people, don't panic. And sometimes not doing something is still a strategy.
Martin, thank you so much for your time.